When we picture the Wild West, we see dusty trails, gunfights, and cattle drives. But the hidden story? Nearly 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and their meals tell a history most folks never heard. Around the campfire, they turned scraps of beans, cornmeal, wild greens, and tough cuts of meat into dishes so clever they fed entire crews and still managed to taste like home. These weren't just recipes, they were survival, culture, and pride served hot from a Dutch oven over open flame. Their food carried memory from Africa and the South, blending it with frontier grit to create flavors that were as bold as the land itself. So, saddle up, because the 25 dishes you're about to discover will change the way you picture the Wild West forever. 1. Okra and Cowpea Trail Stew. Out on the trail, the cook's kettle was the heart of camp. One of the staples simmering low and steady was okra and cowpea trail stew. Black-eyed peas, tough enough to survive weeks in a sack, cooked down with fresh okra when they could find it. Toss in a handful of smoked beef scraps, bones, fat trimmings, anything left after the prime cuts went east. And suddenly, the whole crew had a stew that filled bellies and lifted spirits. For Black Cowboys, it was more than dinner. Black-eyed peas carried the weight of memory, a symbol of luck and survival reaching back to Africa. Okra, too, had roots deeper than the soil they rode across. Together, they turned hardship into heritage, one bubbling pot at a time. It wasn't just food, it was a connection to ancestors, a reminder that even on the harshest trails, culture and comfort could ride alongside survival. 2. Molasses-Glazed Salt Pork with collard greens. When cowboys gathered round the fire, nothing drew them in faster than the smell of sizzling fatback. Cheap, salty, and tough salt pork was trail rations at their most basic. But Black Cowboys knew how to turn scraps into gold. They'd toss strips of pork into a hot pan, splash in a little molasses and vinegar, and watch the fat caramelize into sweet, smoky crackle. Served with collard greens, often foraged from creek beds or picked near settlements. This simple dish became a powerhouse of flavor. The greens soaked up the pork's richness, while the tangy sweet glaze cut through the bitterness of the leaves. It was survival food, sure, but it tasted like a Sunday supper. On the range, it fed hungry men after 16-hour rides. In 2025, you could still put this on the table for under $6 a plate, cheaper than takeout and twice as filling. The secret, cowboy thrift mixed with soul food genius. 3. Sorrel and wild mustard gumbo pot. Not every trail meal came from a sack of beans or salted meat. Sometimes survival meant knowing the land. Black cowboys often gathered wild sorrel and mustard greens along creeks and fields, tossing them into a pot to make what they called a gumbo. The base was nothing fancy. A browned flour roux cooked in lard or drippings, then thinned with water and flavored with smoked bones or scraps no one else wanted. What made it shine was the tang of sorrel and the bite of mustard greens. Together, they turned a humble broth into something bold, bright, and nourishing. Around the campfire, that pot of gumbo was more than a meal. It was proof that you could take weeds most people ignored and make something worth savoring. Cost? Practically nothing. Back then, it was gathered free from the land. Today, you can still make a pot for under $7, stretching into bowls that tell a forgotten cowboy story with every sip. 4. Sweet potato and pecan ash bake. When the nights grew cold on the open prairie, nothing comforted a cowboy more than a dish that felt close to dessert. Enter the sweet potato and pecan ash bake. Sliced sweet potatoes were layered in a Dutch oven with a handful of pecans, sometimes gathered, sometimes traded, then buried under hot ashes from the campfire. Hours later, the lid lifted to reveal tender, caramelized potatoes with nuts toasted golden, almost candied by the slow heat. For Black Cowboys, this was more than a sweet treat. It was a reminder of Southern kitchens and holiday tables they rarely saw while riding the trail. The rich earthiness of the potatoes mixed with the smoky bite from the ashes, making a dish that stretched both ingredients and memories. Back then, it cost pennies. Today, even with pecans at modern prices, you could feed a family this cowboy-style dessert for under $8, cheaper than pie, but with a story baked into every bite. 5. Black-eyed pea and smoked turkey neck hash. At daybreak, when cowboys needed fuel for a long ride, the cook often served up a hash, the kind of meal that stretched scraps into something hearty. Black-eyed pea and smoked turkey neck hash was a favorite. Dried peas were boiled till tender, then mixed with chopped onions, prairie spices, and meaty turkey necks that had been smoked until the bones nearly fell apart. It wasn't fancy, but it stuck to your ribs. Every spoonful carried a smoky depth, the peas soaking up the flavor of the bones, while the onions added just enough sweetness. Around the fire, men would scoop it with cornbread or eat it straight from the pan, laughing and arguing while the sun crept over the horizon. This dish told a story of nothing wasted, bones and beans turning into breakfast fit for the toughest riders. In 2025, you could still make a pot of it for under $6 a serving, proving cowboy thrift is timeless. 6. Cornfield catfish stew. Along muddy rivers and prairie ponds, Black Cowboys sometimes pulled in catfish to break the monotony of beans and salt pork. That's when the cook would throw together a cornfield catfish stew. Whole catfish, skin, bones, and all, went straight into a black kettle set on the coals. Fresh corn kernels, peppers, and onions thickened the broth, turning it into a hearty, smoky stew that could feed the whole crew. It wasn't refined cooking, but it was full of life. The sweetness of the corn balanced the earthy fish, while the peppers added a kick that kept cowboys going after 12 hours in the saddle. For many, it tasted like the South they'd left behind. Riverbanks, family kitchens, and Sunday fish fries, now reimagined on the open trail. Back then, a lucky catch meant dinner for free. Today, you could still make this cowboy classic for around $7 a bowl. Cheaper than seafood chowder, but every bit as rich in flavor and history. 7. Sorrel glazed chicken with wild garlic. Trail chickens were nothing like the plump birds we buy today. They were tough, stringy, and built for scratching out a living. But Black Cowboys knew how to coax tenderness out of the hardest meat. They'd braise those wiry chickens low and slow with handfuls of wild garlic and tart sorrel leaves, creating a sorrel glazed chicken that was equal parts tangy, earthy, and deeply satisfying. The sorrel brought a lemony brightness that cut through the richness of the meat, while the garlic mellowed in the stew until it practically melted. By the time the pot came off the fire, the chicken fell apart under the fork, the glaze clinging to each bite. Around the campfire, it was the kind of dish that made even a long day in the saddle feel worth it. Back then, a scrawny bird and wild greens fed half a crew. In 2025, you can still make a pot of it for under $10, cheaper than takeout chicken, with a story that stretches back to the open range. 8. Pumpkin and sorghum skillet bread. Every cowboy camp needed bread, but flour was often scarce and precious. Black Cowboys leaned on what the land gave them: pumpkin mash, cornmeal, and a drizzle of sorghum syrup. Mixed together and griddled in a cast iron skillet, it baked into pumpkin and sorghum skillet bread. Dense, sweet, and hearty enough to carry in saddlebags for days. This wasn't soft bakery bread. It was rugged and filling, built to last on long rides. The pumpkin kept it moist, the cornmeal gave it grit, and the sorghum added a caramel sweetness that made it taste like a treat. Cowboys would eat it plain on the trail, or dunk slices into coffee at dawn. For Black riders, it carried echoes of Southern kitchens and harvest traditions, bringing comfort far from home. Best part, it cost next to nothing then. And today, you could whip up a skillet full for under $5. Cheap, filling, and packed with frontier flavor. 9. Gullah red rice with salted game bits. Not all cowboy food came from beans and biscuits. Some recipes carried the deep roots of the Gullah people, descendants of West Africans along the Carolina and Georgia coast. One of those dishes was Gullah red rice. On the trail, Black Cowboys recreated it with whatever they had. Rice tinted red with dried peppers or tomatoes, and bits of salted game like rabbit or prairie birds. Cooked slow in a heavy pot, the rice absorbed smoky, spicy flavors until every grain was rich and bold. It wasn't just filling, it was heritage in a kettle, a reminder of the rice fields their ancestors once worked, now transformed into fuel for life on the range. Around the fire, it was a taste of home far from home. The best part, it was cheap then, and it's still cheap now. In 2025, you could make a pot of red rice big enough to feed a family for under $7, and every bite tells a story of resilience. 10. Mesquite smoked goat with mustard greens. Goat wasn't the first choice of meat on the trail, but when a cowboy crew got their hands on one, nothing went to waste. Black Cowboys, drawing on African and Caribbean foodways, knew just what to do. They rubbed the goat with black pepper and salt, then smoked it slow over mesquite wood until the meat turned tender and perfumed with smoke. On the side, they served pot liquor mustard greens, simmered down in the drippings until every bite carried that deep, savory kick. This was celebration food. After weeks of beans and salt pork, smoked goat felt like a feast. The sharp bite of the greens balanced the richness of the meat, creating a meal that kept cowboys strong through long drives. Around the campfire, it wasn't just dinner. It was memory, culture, and pride on a tin plate. Back then, goat was cheap and plentiful. Today, even with rising prices, you can still pull off this dish for under $12 a serving. Cowboy barbecue with a soul food twist. 11. Molasses and vinegar ham hock beans. When the chuck wagon rolled open, there was almost always a pot of beans bubbling. But Black Cowboys knew how to turn plain beans into something unforgettable. They'd simmer pinto beans low and slow with ham hocks, letting the smoky meat fall apart into the broth. Then came the twist, a splash of molasses for sweetness and a dash of vinegar for tang. That sweet-sour balance gave the dish a depth you could taste in every spoonful. For men who spent 16 hours in the saddle, this was comfort in a tin cup. The beans filled bellies, the hocks added protein, and the molasses carried a hint of home kitchens from the South. Around the fire, cowboys leaned back with full stomachs, swapping stories while the last embers glowed. Back then, this cost only a few cents. Today, you could still cook a whole pot for under $8, enough to feed a family and still taste like the Wild West. 12. Charred okra and tomato pot liquor soup. On the trail, nothing was wasted. Not scraps, not bones, not even the water used to boil greens. That's where pot liquor soup came in. Black Cowboys often built it around okra and sun-dried tomatoes, first fire charring them right in the coals. Then they'd simmer it down with lard and bones until the broth turned smoky, tangy, and thick enough to cling to a spoon. This wasn't just soup. It was resourcefulness in a pot. The char gave it depth, the tomatoes added brightness, and the okra thickened it naturally. Cowboys sopped it up with cornbread, grateful for a hot meal after long days riding the range. Around the fire, it warmed more than stomachs. It reminded men that simple food, cooked with care, could taste like a feast. Cost then, almost nothing. Cost now, under $6 for a pot big enough to stretch across 2 meals. Proof that cowboy thrift still works in 2025. 13. Wild plum and corn dumpling cobbler. Every now and then, the chuck wagon offered something that felt close to dessert, and nothing lifted spirits faster than wild plum and corn dumpling cobbler. Black Cowboys foraged tart prairie plums along the trail, stewing them down with a touch of cane sugar if they had it. Then the cook dropped in spoonfuls of cornmeal dumplings, letting them puff up in the bubbling fruit until the whole pot smelled sweet and earthy. It wasn't polished like a bakery pie, but out on the open range, it tasted like pure comfort. The plums brought sharp tang, the dumplings gave heft, and together they made a dish that reminded tired riders of church picnics and family suppers long past. Around the fire, cowboys leaned in for seconds, knowing a treat like this didn't come often. Back then, the cost was whatever the land gave. Today, you can still make it for under $9, cheaper than cobbler from a store, but carrying the soul of the trail. 14. Prairie quail in coffee gravy. When luck and aim lined up, cowboys brought quail back to camp. Black cooks knew how to stretch those little birds into something filling. Prairie quail in coffee gravy. The quail were browned in a skillet with bacon, then stewed in a gravy enriched with strong trail coffee. That bitter edge of coffee, mellowed by smoky fat, gave the dish a richness you'd never expect out on the range. This was campfire ingenuity at its finest, turning a scrawny game bird into a meal that felt downright fancy. The gravy was poured thick over biscuits, cornbread, or just spooned up straight from a tin plate. Cowboys swore it stuck to your ribs better than any stew. Back then, quail were free if you could shoot them, and coffee was already in the saddlebag. Today, even buying the ingredients, you could make a batch for under $10. Proof that the cowboy trick of mixing simple flavors into bold meals still works. 15. Sorrel and sweet onion corn pudding. Some nights on the trail called for comfort, and nothing hit that mark quite like sorrel and sweet onion corn pudding. Cowboys started with cornmeal, eggs, and milk if they had it, baking it into a custard-like dish in the Dutch oven. To make it shine, they folded in wild sorrel for a tangy bite and caramelized sweet onions that melted into the batter. The result was creamy, earthy, and slightly tart, a frontier version of soul food. Around the fire, men dug their spoons straight into the pan, scooping out warm, golden spoonfuls that soothed after a long day. For Black Cowboys, it carried echoes of southern kitchens, but adapted to what the land offered. It cost almost nothing back then, just cornmeal and whatever greens and onions could be found. And in 2025, you can still make a pan for under $7, a side dish that bridges cowboy thrift and family table comfort. 16. Mesquite rubbed venison neck roast. Out on the frontier, venison was a prize that kept whole camps fed. Black cowboys often took the tough cuts, like the neck, and turned them into something unforgettable. The meat was rubbed down with salt, UI pepper, and whatever dried spices the cook had, then set low over mesquite coals. Hours later, the venison neck would fall apart, smoky and tender, ready to be pulled onto tin plates. It wasn't just about the roast itself. It was about the smell that drifted across camp. Cowboys would circle close as the meat cooked, trading stories and songs while the fire did its work. When it was finally served, the roast was often paired with crumbled cornbread scraps to soak up the juices, making sure nothing went to waste. Venison was free if you could hunt it, and mesquite was everywhere. Even today, you could pull this dish off for under $12 a serving, making it a cowboy feast with rugged soul. 17. Collard and turnip green hand pies. Trail food had to be portable, and nothing fit the bill better than collard and turnip green hand pies. Black Cowboys took field greens, simmered down with smoked pork, then tucked the filling into rough cornmeal pastry. Baked right in the camp oven, the pies came out golden and hearty, easy to pack in a saddlebag or eat one-handed on the ride. These pies carried more than flavor. They carried memory. The mix of collards, turnip greens, and smoky meat echoed soul food suppers back home, now reshaped for life on the trail. Around the fire, they were eaten hot and fresh, but by morning, cold leftovers still tasted just as good. Best part, they were cheap to make, then and now. A handful of greens, scraps of pork, and cornmeal could feed the whole crew. In 2025, you could bake a batch for under $8, turning humble ingredients into cowboy-style comfort you can hold in your hand. 18. Blackstrap molasses, barbecue beef ribs. When the herd was slaughtered or a cow went down, cowboys finally got a taste of beef. Black cooks knew how to make the tough ribs shine. They'd baste them with blackstrap molasses mixed with hot pepper brine, then roast them slow over open flames. Each layer of glaze caramelized, turning sticky, smoky, and finger-licking good. This was feast food. After weeks of beans and biscuits, ribs like these felt like a holiday. The sweet heat of molasses and peppers cut through the fattiness, while the smoke tied it all together. Around the campfire, cowboys gnawed bones clean, grinning wide with grease and ash on their hands. What made it cowboy cooking wasn't just the taste, it was the thrift. They turned a cheap, tough cut into a dish worth remembering. In 2025, you can still make a rack this way for under $15, cheaper than a steakhouse, but carrying all the grit and glory of the open range. 19. Sweet potato biscuits with sorghum drizzle. At sunrise, nothing smelled better on the trail than sweet potato biscuits. Black Cowboys mashed boiled sweet potatoes into biscuit dough, stretching flour, and adding sweetness without sugar. Baked in cast iron pans, the biscuits came out dense, earthy, and filling, perfect for long rides ahead. But the magic came with the sorghum. A quick drizzle of dark, sticky syrup turned those humble biscuits into something close to dessert. Sorghum was cheap, easy to carry, and packed more flavor than molasses alone. Around the fire, cowboys tore biscuits apart with their hands, passing the syrup tin from rider to rider, laughing as they wiped sticky fingers on dusty jeans. This wasn't fancy food. It was practical, nourishing, and comforting all at once. The kind of meal that made men forget how hard the trail could be. In 2025, you can bake a batch for under $7. A breakfast that still tastes like cowboy grit and southern memory. 20. Okra and dried shrimp, prairie jambalaya. Some flavors of the trail rode west straight out of Louisiana. Black Cowboys carried dried Gulf shrimp in their saddlebags, light, salty, and built to last. Tossed into a Dutch oven with rice, okra, onions, and peppers, those shrimp came back to life in a bubbling pot of prairie jambalaya. This dish was bold, smoky, and briny, a taste of the Gulf Coast reimagined under prairie skies. The okra thickened the rice and gave it that signature southern feel, while the shrimp added bursts of ocean flavor in a landlocked world. Around the fire, it was more than dinner. It was heritage simmered in a single pot. Best part, jambalaya stretched far. A handful of shrimp flavored a mountain of rice, feeding a whole crew with little cost. Even today, you can cook up a pot for under $9. Proof that cowboy thrift and Creole flair still make one unforgettable meal. 21. Cane syrup fried corn fritters. At dawn, when the herd was restless and cowboys needed a quick bite, the cook would fry up corn fritters. Simple batter made from cornmeal, a little flour, and fresh kernels was dropped into hot grease until golden and crisp. The best part came after, dipping those fritters into thick, dark cane syrup. Sweet, crunchy, and just greasy enough to fuel a day in the saddle. These weren't dainty pancakes. They were rugged trail food. Easy to carry, quick to eat, and satisfying enough to keep hunger at bay through hours of hard riding. Cowboys often ate them standing, hats tilted back, laughing as syrup dripped down their fingers. Back then, cornmeal and cane syrup were cheap staples, and the payoff was pure comfort. Today, you can still fry up a dozen for under $5, making it one of the most affordable cowboy treats you can recreate at home. 22. Slow-cooked goat and green chili stew. On the frontier, goat was hearty, tough, and plentiful. Perfect cowboy meat. To soften it, Black Cowboys cooked it slow with wild green chilies and onions, letting the pot bubble for hours until the meat surrendered its toughness. The result was goat and green chili stew, smoky, spicy, and deeply filling. The heat from the chiles cut through the richness of the goat, while onions melted into the broth, giving it body and sweetness. This stew wasn't just fuel, it was warmth against the chill of prairie nights. Around the fire, cowboys leaned over tin bowls, steam rising in the glow of the flames, trading jokes between bites. Goat cost next to nothing back then, and the chilies grew wild in the Southwest. Even in 2025, you could make this dish for under $10 a serving. It's proof that trail cooking turned scarcity into comfort, one simmering pot at a time. 23. Field pea and salt pork skillet cakes. When beans got boring, the camp cook found ways to make them exciting. One clever trick was field pea and salt pork skillet cakes. Leftover peas were mashed, mixed with minced salt pork, then pan-fried in a hot skillet until crisp on the outside and soft inside. These little cakes packed protein, salt, and fat, exactly what cowboys needed after endless hours on horseback. They were simple to eat with your hands, perfect for quick trail mornings. The smoky pork gave depth, while the peas added heartiness that stretched the meal further than meat alone ever could. Around the fire, cowboys crunched into them while swapping stories, grateful for something different from plain boiled beans. It was survival food turned into comfort food with just a skillet and a little imagination. Cost back then? Pennies. Cost today? Maybe $6 for a whole batch. Cheaper than fast food and carrying the grit of the open range. 24. Wild blackberry and sage cornbread pudding. When berries were in season, Black Cowboys turned simple camp rations into something that felt like a feast. Wild blackberry and sage cornbread pudding started with leftover cornbread, torn into cubes and soaked in a custard of milk and eggs if the camp had them. Foraged blackberries were folded in, and fresh sage added a fragrant herbal note. Baked in a Dutch oven under hot coals, it came out bubbling, sweet, and rustic. This wasn't just dessert, it was a moment of joy on the hard trail. The tart berries burst against the soft custard, while sage gave it a savory balance that kept it from being too rich. Cowboys gathered close when this came off the fire, because treats like this didn't come often. Back then, it cost almost nothing but time and foraged fruit. Today, you can make a pan for under $9. A simple, soulful dish that carries the memory of the prairie in every bite. 25. Cowboy Gumbo Z Herbs. The last dish on our trail ride might surprise you. Cowboy Gumbo Z Herbs. Rooted in Louisiana tradition, this gumbo of many greens was carried west by Black Cowboys who blended old flavors with frontier life. They gathered whatever the land offered: sorrel, mustard, collards, turnip tops, and simmered them with smoked meats in a dark, roux-thickened broth. It was hearty, smoky, and loaded with iron-rich greens that kept cowboys strong during cattle drives. Around the fire, it fed entire crews from one kettle, each bowl a reminder of home kitchens and church suppers left behind. The gumbo carried not just nourishment, but memory. Survival turned into culture, simmered low and slow. Back then, it cost pennies, since the greens were foraged and scraps of meat were plenty. In 2025, you can still make a pot for under $10, serving a dish that ties the Wild West back to Creole roots. One spoonful, and you taste history itself. When we picture the Wild West, we often see dust, guns, and cattle. But the truth is, it was food that held the trail together. Kettles bubbling with beans, Dutch ovens buried in coals, and foraged greens turned into gumbo. For Black Cowboys, these weren't just meals. They were stories of resilience, memory, and ingenuity carried westward with every drive. Each dish, from sweet potato biscuits drizzled with sorghum to goat simmered with wild chiles, shows how scraps became survival and survival became legacy. These forgotten recipes remind us that the Wild West wasn't just grit and glory. It was flavor, culture, and soul food cooked under the stars. So as we dig into these 25 cowboy meals, remember, every bite carries a history most folks never learn, but one that deserves to be told around the fire once again.